Right. So today we're going to get into South Korea's economic miracle.
The Miracle on the Han River.
Yep, the miracle on the Han River. And we're going to be looking at this primarily through a case study from Harvard Business School.
Oh, wow.
It's literally called Korea, the miracle on the Han River.
Sure.
Super straightforward. And then we'll be pulling in some other perspectives from things like
Sure.
The Economist and the CIA World Factbook.
Yeah.
So really kind of looking at this from all angles.
That's good.
Yeah. So, we're talking about a country that went from being literally one of the poorest in the world, like right up there with Somalia and Liberia in the 1960s, to one of the biggest economies in the world just a couple decades later.
It's incredible.
Really is incredible. So I guess that kind of brings us to the big question here. How did they pull this off?
Well, I think a good place to start is to go back to the beginning, right? Like
Yeah.
1953, post-Korean War. The place was in ruins. They had very few resources. Most of the country is mountainous. And
Communication barrier, right?
yeah, huge communication barrier. Not a lot of people outside of Korea spoke Korean. It was
Right.
a tough place to be at that time.
Yeah, they really were starting with almost nothing, weren't they?
Basically. Yeah. But despite all that, there were a couple of key things that they decided to focus on.
Right.
And one of those was land reform.
Okay.
So back in 1949, they started this land reform project,
Yeah.
basically taking land from large landowners and redistributing it to tenant farmers.
So essentially the government comes in and says, hey, we're going to buy your land from you whether you like it or not.
Yeah, basically,
Right.
at this price that we've set.
Right.
And then we're going to turn around and sell it to these farmers at an even lower price.
That's a pretty radical move.
Yeah, it was a huge risk, but it really ended up being a big part of what allowed them to grow later on,
Okay.
because it meant that you had all of these people who were now invested in the success of the country.
Right. They're landowners. They're stakeholders.
Exactly. And the other big thing that they focused on was education. So in 1945, when the Japanese occupation ended, adult literacy in South Korea was something like 25%.
Wow.
And then by 1970, it had jumped all the way up to 88%.
Really?
Yeah, they made primary school mandatory for all children.
That's a huge jump.
It was a major investment.
Wow. So we have land reform and education laying the groundwork here.
Right.
And then in 1961, Park Chung-hee comes to power. He's this military leader who really wants to make South Korea an economic powerhouse. He's got this vision of a rich country, strong army.
Yeah, he was very much inspired by the success of Japan after World War II.
So how did he actually go about making this vision a reality? Was it more than just talk?
Oh, yeah. He took a lot of concrete steps. He created this organization called the Economic Planning Board, the EPB.
Okay.
And basically, they were the ones who came up with and implemented South Korea's economic strategy.
That's a mastermind group.
Exactly. And they created these 5-year plans that focused on specific industries that they wanted to develop. So it was really a very deliberate approach.
So they were basically picking winners and losers, I guess.
Yeah, you could say that. It's what's called a developmental state model.
Now, what exactly does developmental state mean for those of us who, maybe aren't economics professors or whatever?
Sure. So in a developmental state, the government takes a very active role in shaping and directing the economy.
Okay.
So, for example, they'll strategically devalue the currency to make exports cheaper.
Oh.
And then they'll provide tax breaks and other incentives to exporters.
So they're really putting their thumb on the scale to make sure that these specific industries succeed.
Exactly. And they were really serious about this, too. They even had monthly meetings to promote exports and...
Monthly. Wow, they were really on top of this.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, they needed capital to fuel all of this growth.
Right.
And capital was pretty scarce in those early days, so they had to get creative.
Okay, how so?
Well, one source was wages sent home by Korean workers who were working abroad. A lot of them were in West Germany.
Yeah, I read about that.
Yeah.
A lot of miners and nurses.
Yeah, exactly. They also got reparations from Japan for the period of Japanese occupation.
Interesting.
And they even got some funding from the Vietnam War.
Oh, wow.
Mm.
So they really were pulling from all sorts of different sources.
I know they had to.
Now let's talk about the chaebol.
Okay.
These family-run conglomerates like Samsung and Hyundai and LG,
Sure.
they're a huge part of the South Korean economy even today.
Right.
What role did they play in all of this?
So the chaebol were actually around before Park Chung-hee came to power, mostly as trading houses.
Oh.
But under his regime, they were given preferential treatment.
Right.
They got access to cheap loans,
Yeah.
tax breaks, and often exclusive rights to big projects.
So they were kind of the government's chosen champions.
Pretty much, yeah.
But that kind of close relationship must have had some downsides too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It led to accusations of unfair competition,
Sure.
stifling smaller businesses, and even undue political influence.
Right, so it's not all sunshine and roses, I guess.
No, definitely not.
So we have government intervention, we have the rise of the Kaibal, and we have this incredible period of economic growth.
Yeah.
But things don't always go smoothly forever,
Actually,
right?
no, they
Right.
don't. And that's where we get to the 1997 Asian financial crisis,
Ooh, yeah.
a major turning point in South Korea's economic history. And that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive.
Stay tuned. Okay, so last time we were talking about South Korea's crazy economic growth in the 60s and 70s.
Right, really taking off.
Yeah. But like we said, things don't always go up and up forever.
Definitely not.
And in 1997, the Asian financial crisis hit, and it hit South Korea pretty hard.
It did. It was a real wake-up call for a lot of people.
And this wasn't just some small little bump in the road either. This
Yeah.
was a major global economic event.
Oh, yeah, it sent shockwaves through the whole world, really.
So for South Korea, which had just joined the OECD, feeling pretty good about themselves.
Yeah, like they had arrived.
Yeah, exactly. This must have been a huge blow.
It was. It was a really difficult time.
So how did this crisis actually unfold? What happened?
Well, basically, there was this sudden withdrawal of foreign capital. Like, investors got spooked and they started pulling their money out of Asia.
And this had a domino effect, right? Like it started in one country and then spread to others.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
for South Korea, one of the biggest problems was that the chaebol had taken on a lot of debt.
So they were over-leveraged.
Yeah, basically.
Right.
And when the crisis hit, they were left in a really vulnerable position.
So the value of the Korean won just plummeted, I imagine.
It did. It lost something like half its value in a matter of weeks.
Wow. So what could they do at that point?
Well, they ended up having to go to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout.
The IMF. Now, those bailouts usually come with some pretty strict conditions, right?
Yeah, they do. And in South Korea's case, the IMF demanded a lot of austerity measures.
Like what kind of things?
Well, they had to cut government spending, raise interest rates, and even restructure some of the cable.
So it was pretty painful, I imagine.
Oh, yeah. It was a really tough time for a lot of people. There were a lot of job losses and businesses went bankrupt.
And I bet there was a lot of resentment towards the IMF.
There was. A lot of people felt like they had been forced to swallow this really bitter pill.
They must have been a real blow to their national pride, too.
Yeah, absolutely. They had worked so hard to achieve this economic miracle, and then suddenly it felt like it was all slipping away.
And I imagine the term IMF crisis probably still carries a lot of negative connotations in South Korea.
It does. It's a reminder of a very difficult period in their history.
So even though it was painful, did this crisis ultimately lead to some positive changes?
I think it did. It forced South Korea to take a hard look at its economic system.
And make some reforms?
Yeah, they had to clean up their financial sector and start building a social safety net.
Okay, so they kind of had to step back and reassess their priorities, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't just about economic growth anymore.
It was about creating a more stable and sustainable system.
Exactly. And that actually leads us to a really interesting shift in their strategy.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
They started to look beyond manufacturing as their main driver of growth.
Interesting. So what did they turn to?
Well, they began to focus more on services and cultural exports.
The Korean wave.
Yeah, exactly. K-pop, K-dramas, K-beauty, all of that.
And this wasn't just a happy accident, right? Like the government actually played a role in making this happen.
Absolutely. They saw the potential of pop culture as a new engine for economic growth.
So how did they go about supporting this new wave?
Well, they invested a lot of money in it, like $1 billion to support the development of pop culture industries.
Wow, that's a serious commitment.
It was. They provided subsidies, low-interest loans, and other forms of support.
So they were really putting their money where their mouth was.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And they understood that it wasn't just about creating content, it was also about building infrastructure.
Yeah, like high-speed internet, for example.
Exactly. South Korea invested heavily in broadband, and that really helped to fuel the growth of the gaming industry in particular.
Right, because you need that kind of infrastructure to be able to create and distribute those kinds of products.
Absolutely. But the Kaibal also played a role in all of this.
Yeah, how so?
Well, they were quick to see the potential of this new wave, and they started investing in it too.
So they weren't just sticking to their old industries, they were branching out.
Yeah, they saw how these cultural products could help to boost demand for their other products too.
Oh, interesting. Like how?
Well, for example, they started linking their electronics to this new wave of cultural content.
So it was about selling a whole lifestyle, not just individual products.
Exactly. And it worked. The Korean wave has been incredibly successful in promoting Korean culture and products around the world.
It really has. It's amazing to see how far they've come.
It is. But amidst all this success, there's still this major issue that looms over South Korea.
Yeah, North Korea.
Exactly. And that's something we need to talk about.
We've been talking about, South Korea's incredible economic transformation.
Yeah, from rags to riches, pretty much.
But there's this constant tension hanging over everything.
Right, the North Korea situation.
Exactly. Like, you can't talk about South Korea without talking about North Korea.
No, absolutely not. It's a huge part of their story. The division of the peninsula, the Korean War, the fact that North Korea is still, a closed-off totalitarian state.
It's just this constant source of uncertainty and anxiety.
Yeah, definitely. And it has a real impact on their economic strategy, too.
Right. Like, how do you plan for the future when you have this huge unknown variable right there on your doorstep?
Exactly. And then there's the question of reunification. Like, what would that even look like?
Yeah. And how much would it cost?
Oh, yeah. Estimates vary wildly, but it would be a massive undertaking for South Korea.
Like trillions of dollars, probably.
Yeah, potentially. It would be a huge gamble with both potential benefits and huge costs.
Right. Like, on the one hand, it could open up new markets and resources.
Yeah, and potentially create a more stable and secure environment.
But on the other hand, it could also be a huge drain on the South Korean economy.
Yeah, and it could lead to all sorts of social and political challenges.
Right? It's just a really complex issue with no easy answers.
Definitely not. And it's something that South Koreans have to live with every day.
And speaking of challenges, we've talked a lot about the role of the K-ball in South Korea's economic development.
Yeah, these massive family-run conglomerates.
But it seems like they're kind of a double-edged sword.
In a way, yeah. They've been instrumental in driving growth and innovation.
Right. Like, they're the ones who build Samsung and Hyundai and all these other global brands.
Exactly. But their dominance also creates some problems.
Yeah, like what?
Well, there are concerns about stifling competition, making it hard for smaller businesses to thrive.
Right. And there have been accusations of corruption and undue influence on the government.
Yeah, definitely. It's a complicated relationship.
So the question is, can South Korea maintain its economic dynamism while also addressing these concerns about the K-ball?
Right. Like, can they find a way to make the system more fair and competitive without undermining the success of these companies?
It's a tough balance.
It is. And there's no easy answer.
But it's something that they're going to have to figure out.
Yeah, for sure. The K-ball are such a big part of the economy that any changes are going to have a major impact.
And then on top of all that, you have the whole geopolitical situation to deal with.
Right. South Korea's in a really tricky spot, caught between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, they're allies with the U.S., but they also have close economic ties with China.
And those two countries are increasingly at odds with each other.
It's like they're walking a tightrope.
Yeah, they have to be very careful not to alienate either side.
And then you also have the historical baggage with Japan to contend with.
Right. The legacy of Japanese colonialism is still a very sensitive issue in South Korea.
Yeah, it affects everything from diplomacy to trade to cultural exchange.
And it's something that continues to cause tension between the two countries.
So it's not just about economics.
Yeah.
It's about history and politics and national identity.
Yeah, all of those things are intertwined.
And amidst all these external pressures, we can't forget about the internal challenges that South Korea is facing.
Right. We talked about the Korean wave and how successful it's been.
Yeah, but there's also a darker side to all that success.
There is. There's a lot of pressure to succeed in South Korea.
Yeah, it's a very competitive society.
And that can lead to burnout and anxiety and even depression.
There's even a term for it, the burnout society.
Yeah, it's a real problem, especially for young people.
They're facing a tough job market, rising housing costs, and a lot of pressure to achieve.
And that can take a toll on their mental health.
So it's like this paradox. South Korea has achieved so much materially.
Yeah, they've created this economic miracle.
But a lot of people are struggling.
They're not happy.
It's a reminder that progress isn't just about economic growth.
It's also about well-being.
About creating a society where people can flourish.
Exactly. And that's something that South Korea is still working on.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into South Korea's economic miracle,
Yeah.
I think the big takeaway for me is that it's a really complex story.
Absolutely, with a lot of ups and downs.
Yeah. And there's still a lot of challenges that they're facing.
Yeah, for sure. But it's also a really inspiring story.
Yeah. I mean, they came from literally nothing and built one of the most advanced economies in the world.
It's amazing what they've accomplished.
It really is. And it'll be interesting to see what the future holds for them.
Yeah, who knows what the next chapter will bring.
Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
Yeah, this was fun.
It was. Till next time, keep exploring.